In September, at the Lincoln Memorial, President Johnson offered words of tribute to a unique American, Carl Sandberg.
Sandberg seemed to have his finger always on the American pulse. He seemed to be able to give voice to the whole range of America's hopes and America's hates. He seemed able to communicate, above all, the restless energy that has vitalized and stimulated on occasion degraded the history of our nation. He could give you the savage emotions of a lynch mob. He could just as well express with affection and insight the courage and the impatience, even the braggadocio that spurred our amazing development. And at the end of a long day with the phones all ringing and the world in disarray, those words have a very special impact for some of us. Well, Carl Sandberg is gone. He is part of the earth that he celebrated in Illinois and Kentucky and North Carolina. He's part of the American earth. What will live on forever, though, is his faith in the individual human beings whom we impersonally call American. He knew that always in America, the strong men keep coming on.
Throughout the month of September, President Johnson would indeed face many long days, with phones ringing far into the night, with much of the world facing problems. Yet he would meet many of those Americans Carl Sandberg described, the strong men who keep coming on. The first strong men of September were the millions of Vietnamese who voted for a president under fire, who braved the massive Viet Cong efforts to terrorize and disrupt their national elections. Before the voting ever got underway, the word fraud was being heard from Hanoi to Washington. To counter critics at home and abroad, the president asked a group of American leaders from all walks of life to go to Vietnam, observe, and report back. As one governor summed it up to President Johnson, too much attention had been focused on the possibility of irregularities, and not enough on the really significant thing, that these people with great courage had come out and given as moving and profound an example of the desire for self-determination as you could find anywhere. On September 7th, President and Mrs. Johnson left for Texas. Congress, out for a 10-day recess, would not convene until Monday, the 11th. It was a good time to visit with the Austin side of the family and see firsthand how their grandson was coming along. This brief respite also afforded the president a chance to get acquainted with a young man whom Linda has been seeing quite frequently during the summer. Marine Captain Chuck Robb, assigned as a military aide to the White House, was becoming a familiar face at the bridge table, at beach parties, and at the midnight suppers Linda enjoys hosting for her close friends. Here in the land that his family had known for generations, President Johnson renewed his strength before returning to Washington. He knew if the bulk of his programs were to be enacted by the end of this session, he faced an uphill battle with Congress. It was no secret that the lawmakers were disquieted over the recent rioting and crime in the streets, that they were divided over the war in Vietnam, and that many members of the House Ways and Means Committee were still unconvinced that the administration-backed tax increase was justified. But Lyndon Johnson was no stranger to uphill battles. He was raised in a land that gave no quarter, that yielded reluctantly every inch of the way. If there was a sense of tranquility and prosperity in this once hard-scrabble hill country, it was earned through the toughness of the men who dug in and fought for it. This philosophy holds true all the way to the White House. For even there, a chief executive soon learns that he gets only what he digs in and fights for. With the Labor Day weekend behind him, the president assembled his team in the cabinet room. Each secretary represented a facet of American life, and each held a key position in helping the president push through the legislation and appropriation bills so vital to maintaining and improving that life. Chief among these bills was the Model Cities program, the most far-reaching attack on urban blight ever proposed. It had already suffered congressional combat scars in the House, as its committee cut the request by almost 2/3. And Model Cities was only one of dozens of programs buried, sometimes languishing, in Congress since the beginning of the session. These proposals ranged from a relatively small request to exterminate rats in the nation's cities to a major outlay of over $2 billion for the Economic Opportunity Act. Even food stamps, a modest program to increase the food buying power of needy families, had been deadlocked for months. The president decided it was a time to carry the fight for what they believed, a time for the administration forces to exert maximum pressure, to pry bills out of committee, to focus public attention on deadlocked legislation. Personally leading one such attack, President Johnson on September 14th flew to Kansas City to spearhead an all-out administration effort to get action on his Safe Streets and Crime Bill. The Crime Bill and its accompanying proposal, the State Firearms Control Act of 1967, were still tied up in House and Senate subcommittees. As Air Force One approached Kansas City, it was evident that September's annual crop of severe storms would be as bad as the weathermen predicted. Even as President Johnson touched down, Hurricanes Doria, Chloe, and Beulah were running up their death tolls across the Caribbean islands. At the Municipal Auditorium in Kansas City, the president addressed a meeting of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. He told them of the comprehensive federal legislation now before Congress that, once enacted, would help local authorities combat the problem of crime at all levels. He emphasized, however, that these proposed laws were meant to supplement, not supplant, local law enforcement. Keeping the peace from the birth of the Republic to the present moment is a responsibility that rests squarely on the shoulders of local authorities. We look to you, the president told the police chiefs, for protection of our families, our homes, and our lives. You have a right to look to us, your public servants, to see that your efforts are not forgotten. By mid-September, with no action on his tax increase request, the president mustered his forces for what may be his most unpopular yet most necessary request to Congress. Although 260 of the nation's non-government economists, led by Walter Heller, endorsed the president's move, the bill was still tied up in committee. Secretary Fowler would champion the administration's cause on the Hill, warning bluntly that the alternative to the surcharge would be an economy in shambles. The president publicly pointed out that a delay in the tax, or worse, lack of passage, would bring on a tax of another kind, a weakening of the dollar, high and ruinous interest rates, and a costly, burdensome inflation. For the president, the month of September was not all legislative battles and budget. There were also those rare moments when even a president comes face to face with the duties of a father. It was quite evident that the personable young Marine officer had passed muster, not only with his commander-in-chief, but with his daughter as well. The President and Mrs. Johnson announced the engagement of Linda to Marine Captain Charles S. Robb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The wedding will take place at the White House in December, before Chuck leaves for a scheduled duty assignment in Vietnam. soon found out that winning the heart of a president's daughter exacts its price in moments of stolen privacy. For a few months, he will discover what Linda and Lucy have known for years, that first family news is public news. And you can never completely escape the probing questions of the press. To White House guests who have seen their president stage elaborate entertainments, ranging from opera and ballet to folk singers and Broadway musicals, nothing is really surprising. But September's country fair on the South Lawn would tax the imagination of even the most frequent visitor. The guests, this time not visiting heads of state, but 500 sons and daughters of Washington's officialdom. Although his administration was deeply committed to a $7 billion program of action to help the cities, President Johnson knew that federal action alone could be only a beginning. Private efforts were central to success. On September 13th, the president invited to the White House those congressional leaders, state governors, and executive directors of major associations whose common goals are firmly tied to the welfare of the cities. They were invited to witness and to share in the first massive, privately sponsored, all-out attack on urban blight. A group of the nation's largest life insurance companies had diverted $1 billion from their normal stream of investments and pledged this sum to back projects in high-risk areas. President Johnson hailed the privately sponsored pledge as an historic contribution. It would be a terrific stimulant to the rent supplement program, presently bogged down in Congress. But beyond that, it would go down as a major investment in improving the quality of American life. These unheroic, quietly carried out actions were further evidence of President Johnson's basic faith in the individual coming forth in a time of need. As Carl Sandberg said, always in America, the strong men keep coming on. America's strong men come from many walks of life, wear many guises, and carry out many diverse roles. But none is so familiar to the nation, and particularly to the serviceman overseas, than a unique ambassador of good humor, Bob Hope. Welcome to the White House after winding up a successful savings bond drive. This beguiling American institution received personal thanks from President Johnson. The quality that elevates Bob Hope head and shoulders above most entertainers is not his brand of humor in itself. It's where he takes that humor. Over the years, as regular as clockwork, he has projected his talents wherever America's strength and will were being tested. Today, there is a new type of test for the American will. And as the nation responded in the forests of the Argonne, the coral beaches of Okinawa, it also meets the challenge in the Ai Drang Valley, the Bin Bin province, with men like Sergeant David Dalby. In presenting the nation's highest award to Sergeant Dalby, the president emphasized the fact that he, Lyndon Johnson, was also a critic of the war, but a critic in a different sense.
No one hates war and killing more than I do. No sane American can greet the news from Vietnam with enthusiasm. Indeed, an American who rejoiced in war and conflict should be instantly removed from any position. But in the same sense, we cannot cheer as we learn of the impact of our might on the enemy. In the spirit of Abraham Lincoln, we must confront our obligations with dedication and with resolution, and we must be moved by anguish and compassion at the consequences. Until the day comes when we lay down our arms and we deal in good faith with North Vietnam across a conference table, brave young men like David Dalby will have to fight to prevent others from imposing their military solution on the people of South Vietnam and Southeast Asia.
Because of the time it takes to process a unit citation or a Medal of Honor, the names of Bin Din Province and the Ai Drang Valley are already spoken of in the past tense. In September 1967, the place on the map symbolic of America's resistance to aggression lay to the north, in the DMZ, concentrated around 3 red clay hills called Con Pien. Here, 1,200 Marines, literally dug in and living for weeks at a time in mud-filled shell craters, were taking on the chin the most grueling artillery barrage of the war. But in so doing, they effectively blocked Hanoi's most direct infiltration and invasion route, the DMZ. At the same time, America's highest security councils were responding to another threat, one that was indirect, but infinitely more sinister. Communist China, as a nuclear power, had developed an ICBM technology, and by the 1970s could pose a threat not only to our Asian neighbors, but the United States as well. In the most definitive and far-reaching strategic policy statement ever made by any administration, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara announced America's intention to build a limited nuclear missile defense system to be fully deployed within 5 years. The ABM system would be a thin one, designed only to blunt a Red Chinese offensive. In this manner, the delicate nuclear balance between the United States and the Soviet Union would not be jeopardized. The administration forces in the final days of September saw their first legislative victories following the Labor Day recess. Drawn-out hearings, days in conference, and debates on the floor resulted in, first, the extension in the sorely needed Food Stamp Act, a program that had already helped to feed nearly 2 million deprived Americans, and that now stood ready to expand that record. In the same week, the Senate, in a resounding vote, restored House-cut appropriations for rent subsidies and model cities, the 2 key programs designed to spearhead the administration's attack on urban problems. The House went on to reverse itself on an earlier vote, adding to an omnibus health package the full $40 million requested by the administration to help exterminate rats in the slums. Beyond the fulfillment of these domestic obligations, Congress passed a bill earnestly sought by President Johnson in support of his hemispheric policies, the Inter-American Development Bank Authorization. The bill permits a contribution of $900 million over a 3-year period to help the bank expand its development projects throughout Latin America. The bank, through a solid record of accomplishments in the past 7 years, has become a major instrument of the Alliance for Progress and a model for other regions of the world.
More than ceremony summons us here to the East Room this morning. We celebrate a new era for the capital city.
Finally, on the 28th of September, after a Senate confirmation without dissent, President Johnson was able to usher in a new era for the District of Columbia by swearing in Walter Washington and his assistant, Thomas Fletcher.
The citizens of the district have waited almost a century for this day to come and all that it symbolizes. And this is the day and this is the year that the district emerges into the world of the 20th century government. With the recent reorganization plan, the nation's capital was liberated from the outworn practices of the past years. That reorganization plan equips the city with new machinery to let its government serve the needs of its people. But the best machinery can function effectively only in the hands of the best men. I looked across America to try to find these men, and I think we found them. Men with the strength and the character and the vision to deal with tough problems. And now, this morning, we commit those problems to their capable hands.
Beulah, one of the worst hurricanes to ever hit the hemisphere, had ripped across the Gulf of Mexico, had cut a deadly swath through the jungles of Yucatan, and had finally battered itself to oblivion on the open range country of South Texas. The governor of Texas, John B. Connally, asked the president to declare a disaster area in the counties hardest hit by Beulah's winds and unprecedented floods. On the 28th of September, the president, accompanied by the governor and Senators Yarborough and Tower, made a personal inspection tour of the flooded area. President Johnson did not have to look far to find strong men in Texas, for trouble seems to bring out the best in men, and Beulah was no exception. The Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard, under a combined command, used their weapons of war to rescue families from rooftops, to haul relief supplies into stricken areas. The Red Cross, the Public Health Service, many federal departments, and thousands of private citizens worked round the clock, providing food, shelter, and hospitalization for Beulah's victims. There was much work to be done, but the rebuilding of roads and schools was not the immediate concern. It was care and comfort for the thousands of homeless from both sides of the Rio Grande.
The thing that I want to stress particularly by coming here this afternoon and visiting some of the hospital centers and the food centers and flying over the area was to let these people know that their government cares for them, and let our neighbors know, who the unfortunate victims of distress across the river, that we care for them and that we are a compassionate and understanding government, and in an hour of need that we're there.
As September ended, the president addressed himself to the cruelest test his country faced: perseverance in the face of doubt, debate, and dissent. At San Antonio, he took his administration's policies on Vietnam before a national convention of legislative leaders. He reaffirmed America's readiness to end the bombing and to enter into productive talks. But he also sounded a cautionary note against the dangers of debate and dissent.
The true peacekeepers in the world tonight are not those who urge us to retire from the field in Vietnam, who tell us to try to find the quickest, cheapest exit from that tormented land, no matter what the consequences to us may be. The true peacekeepers are those men who stand out there on the DMZ at this very hour, taking the worst that the enemy can give. The true peacekeepers are the soldiers who are breaking the terrorist grip around the villages of Vietnam, the civilians who are bringing medical care and food and education to people who have already suffered a generation of war. And these gallant men have our prayers, have our thanks, have our heartfelt praise, and our deepest gratitude. And let the world know that the keepers of peace will endure through every trial, and that with the full backing of their countrymen, they are going to prevail.
September had been an uphill battle. 10 out of 15 appropriation bills had still not been reported out of Congress. There had been no action on either the crime bill or the tax increase. But there had been progress in the land just the same, the most rewarding kind of progress. Progress achieved by men who go about their tasks quietly, unceremoniously, the workhorses of the nation. Strong men in private enterprise came forward without fanfare to help cure America's urban problems. Strong men were forging a new government for the nation's capital. Strong men were resisting aggression in faraway places. Always in America, strong men keep coming on, and always, it seems, strong men are there to lead.